In the quaint town of Maplewood, where winter's chill bites deep and summer brings blooms to every corner, everyone knows George, a 72-year-old widower who lives alone in a modest cottage at the edge of town. For years, George's sole companion was Kiki, his loyal golden retriever. With a glimmer in his eyes and boundless energy, Kiki was more than a dog to George. He was a connection to the joyful days with his late wife, a source of comfort who filled the empty spaces of George's days with warmth and purpose. To George, Kiki was a friend, a listener, a reminder that he was never truly alone. Every morning, George and Kiki followed a sacred ritual. They would walk through the quiet woods that circled Maplewood, George admiring the birdsong and gentle rustling of leaves, while Kiki bounded freely, chasing butterflies and diving into piles of fallen leaves. The sound of Kiki's paws on the forest floor was like music to George's ears, a melody that filled the silent gaps of his life, making him feel whole. But then, a year ago, tragedy struck. One autumn morning, during one of their walks, Kiki vanished. George searched for him everywhere, calling out through the dense woods, but Kiki was nowhere to be found. Weeks turned into months, with George scouring every corner of town, posting signs, and enlisting the help of the community. Maplewood's residents joined the search, but over time, even the most hopeful among them began to lose faith. Still, George couldn't let go. He held on to hope with a quiet, unwavering resolve. As the seasons changed, George's search turned into a lonely vigil. Each day, he took his solitary walks, hoping that one day he might catch a glimpse of Kiki bounding through the trees toward him, but the woods were silent. The absence of Kiki turned those once joyful walks into reminders of loss, as if the light in George's life had dimmed just a bit more with each passing day. The months slipped by, and George's steps grew slower. His once eager morning routine became somber and empty, his hope a heavy weight he carried with him. The community gently tried to encourage him to move on, suggesting he adopt a new dog. But George's heart belonged to Kiki. In his quiet moments, he would sit by the window, gazing out at the empty woods, feeling the ache of loneliness that only Kiki's presence could ease. Then, one foggy autumn morning, just as the leaves were turning golden and red, something miraculous happened. As George was returning from yet another solitary walk, he saw a familiar shape on the horizon. It was Kiki, his golden coat dirty and matted, his frame thinner than before but unmistakably him. George's heart leaped, and he stumbled forward, calling out with a choked voice. Kiki trotted over, his tail wagging slowly, eyes filled with a mix of joy and weariness. George fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around Kiki, tears streaming down his face. Kiki licked his face, and for the first time in a year, George felt whole again. But there was something different about Kiki. Though he was back, he was quieter, more reserved. His eyes, once bright and playful, seemed to hold secrets, like he'd seen things beyond the forest. Kiki often sat alone, staring into the distance, his gaze sometimes settling on George with a haunting, knowing look. It was as if Kiki had returned with a story untold, one that only he knew but could not say. George felt a mixture of joy and curiosity, wondering what his faithful friend had been through and what it meant that Kiki had come back to him now. The joyful reunion was tempered by this new mystery. George couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed between them. Kiki's behavior was tinged with an unspoken sadness, a hint of something hidden that George couldn't quite reach. Where had Kiki been for all those months, and what experiences had he endured? As George held his beloved friend close, he knew there was a story waiting to be uncovered, one that might reveal a truth beyond anything he could imagine. As days passed since Kiki's return, George noticed subtle but undeniable changes in his beloved companion. Kiki, once lively and full of spirit, now seemed haunted, almost as if carrying a weight George couldn't see. The dog who used to leap at the door for their daily walks now hesitated, watching George with eyes that held a strange intensity. At night, Kiki would sometimes whimper softly, pacing the room as if reliving a memory only he understood. George tried to soothe him, patting his head, whispering, "It's all right, buddy. You're home now." But Kiki would often pull away, retreating to a corner where he'd curl up, his gaze distant. George felt his heart breaking in a new way, watching Kiki suffer. Where had he been all those months? What had he seen, or perhaps, what had he lost? George's mind began to fill with questions, the kind that gnawed at him, giving him sleepless nights. The townspeople noticed too, remarking how Kiki looked like a different dog altogether. Some friends would reassure George, saying, "Give him time, he'll come around." But George sensed it was more than just the passing of time that was needed. He felt an urgent need to reach Kiki, to understand the darkness clouding his friend's spirit. One rainy night, George sat by the fireplace, with Kiki lying close but still in his own world. George reached into an old wooden chest and pulled out a dusty photo album. He leafed through pictures of himself and his late wife, each memory more bittersweet than the last. When he reached a photo of a young Kiki as a pup, George held it up, a sad smile tugging at his lips. "You remember this, don't you?" he murmured, showing Kiki the picture. Kiki lifted his head, his eyes catching the light of the fire. For a brief moment, George saw a flicker of recognition, a glimpse of the Kiki he once knew. Then, as quickly as it came, the light faded, and Kiki lay his head back down, letting out a deep, almost sorrowful sigh. George felt his chest tighten, a sinking realization dawning on him that whatever Kiki had experienced, it had changed him deeply, perhaps irrevocably. Determined to help Kiki heal, George decided to retrace their steps to the last place they had walked together before Kiki's disappearance. Maybe something in that place would spark a memory, a key to unlock whatever haunted Kiki's soul. So, one brisk morning, he bundled up and called Kiki, who came to him slowly, his eyes wary but loyal as ever. They set out into the woods, George hoping that this walk might be the first step toward understanding what had left his beloved friend so broken. As they neared the grove where Kiki had vanished, Kiki began to slow, his ears flattening, his body language uneasy. George knelt beside him, gently running his hand over Kiki's back, whispering, "It's okay, boy. We'll get through this together." But Kiki's body trembled as they stood there. Then, to George's surprise, Kiki led him past their usual path, deeper into the woods, taking turns down unfamiliar trails. George followed, feeling a strange sense of anticipation. After a while, they reached a small clearing. There, hidden under the leaves, was a shallow, improvised grave. George's heart skipped a beat. He knelt down, carefully brushing away the leaves, and realized he was looking at the remains of another dog, long abandoned. His mind reeled with questions. What had happened here? And how did Kiki know about it? As if in answer, Kiki lay down beside the grave, his eyes fixed on the remains, as if paying respect. George felt a pang of sorrow mixed with confusion. Had Kiki been here before? Had he tried to help this lost soul, only to lose his way back home? George gently placed his hand on Kiki's head, feeling the weight of an invisible story he could only piece together through fragments. Kiki's haunted eyes, his changed behavior, it all began to make a heartbreaking sense. In the days that followed, George felt a strange sadness settle over their home, a silence that Kiki seemed to carry like an unspoken burden. George took care to be gentle with him, sharing his quiet presence in hopes that Kiki would feel understood. He tried to bring back the joy of their old routines, giving Kiki his favorite treats and attempting to play with him, but Kiki's spirit remained subdued. Unable to shake his growing sense of dread, George decided to seek help from a local animal therapist, hoping they might help Kiki find peace. The therapist explained that animals, much like humans, could carry trauma and even grief. The therapist suggested that Kiki's behavior might be due to a deep bond he'd formed with the dog whose grave they'd found, a connection forged in survival and loss, perhaps even a friendship that had ended tragically. Listening, George felt tears prick his eyes. He had seen Kiki as his own source of comfort, yet Kiki had also given part of his heart to another lost soul in the woods, and that loyalty had cost him deeply. George promised himself that he would do whatever he could to help Kiki heal, to honor the bond his friend had shared with that unknown companion. But deep down, he feared that some wounds, even with time, might never fully heal. Despite his fears, George began working with Kiki, encouraging him each day with gentle reassurance, walking him back through familiar places and new ones, hoping that, step by step, Kiki would find a way to let go of the shadows he carried. One crisp morning, after months of patient encouragement and care, George noticed a small change in Kiki. They were taking one of their daily walks when, for the first time in months, Kiki's tail began to wag just a bit faster. It was a subtle but unmistakable glimmer of his old spirit returning. George's heart swelled with hope, and he knelt down, calling Kiki to him. Kiki trotted over, his gaze steady, as if he, too, felt the stirrings of something healing deep inside. Inspired by this small victory, George decided it was time to revisit the clearing in the woods, the place where Kiki's journey of loss had begun. He wasn't sure if the visit would bring peace or more pain, but something in him sensed that facing that place together might help Kiki confront his lingering sorrow. With a quiet determination, George prepared a simple tribute, a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked from his yard. He wasn't certain how Kiki would react, but he felt compelled to honor the memory of the dog whose life had touched his beloved companion so deeply. They made their way through the forest, Kiki's steps steady beside George's, yet his gaze occasionally drifting toward the distant treetops. When they arrived at the clearing, Kiki froze, his body tense but alert. George knelt beside him, placing the bouquet near the grave as a sign of respect. He whispered softly, "I'm here with you, Kiki. We're in this together." For a long moment, they stood there in silence, side by side, the woods holding a reverent stillness. Then, in an unexpected gesture, Kiki leaned into George, pressing his head gently against his shoulder, as if acknowledging the unspoken bond that had grown between them. George closed his eyes, feeling a warmth spread through him, a quiet relief that perhaps, just perhaps, Kiki was beginning to let go of his pain. In the weeks that followed, the clearing became a place of pilgrimage for George and Kiki. They would visit regularly, each time leaving a small tribute, a flower, a smooth stone, a bit of yarn from George's sweater. Slowly, Kiki's spirit seemed to lighten. His eyes grew a bit brighter, his steps more energetic. George noticed Kiki becoming more affectionate again, returning to his old habits of nudging George's hand for pets and rolling over for belly rubs. One evening, after another peaceful visit to the clearing, George noticed Kiki barking excitedly at the edge of the woods. It had been so long since he'd heard Kiki bark with such enthusiasm that he hurried over, his heart racing with excitement. Kiki was pawing at the ground near the base of an old oak tree, his nose low to the earth, his tail wagging furiously. Curious, George knelt down and brushed aside the leaves. Beneath them lay a small weathered collar, half buried in the dirt, its tags faded but still readable. The name engraved on the tag was Buddy. George's eyes widened as he turned the collar in his hands, a strange sensation filling his chest. Buddy. Was this the name of the lost dog Kiki had bonded with during his time away? George looked at Kiki, who was watching him intently, his eyes filled with a kind of quiet understanding. It was as if Kiki knew that finding the collar was important, that it held a part of the story he couldn't tell with words. George clutched the collar, feeling an odd mix of sorrow and gratitude. He whispered, "Thank you, Buddy, for being there for him." He buried the collar near the makeshift grave, adding a final tribute to the memory of Kiki's silent friend, honoring the loyalty and companionship that Buddy had given Kiki during their time together. Kiki lay down beside the grave, his body relaxed, his gaze steady as if he, too, was saying a final goodbye. From that day on, something shifted in Kiki. It was as though the last piece of a puzzle had clicked into place. He no longer stared into the distance with that haunting look. Instead, he seemed more present, more himself. George felt the difference too. Kiki had found a way to release the weight he'd carried for so long, and in doing so, he had brought George closer to his own healing. It was as if they had both walked through a shadow and emerged into the light together, each bearing the marks of loss but stronger for having shared it. With Kiki's spirit renewed, George began to notice little changes in their life. Kiki seemed more willing to engage, his playfulness returning in small bursts as he'd paw at George's leg, urging him to toss a ball or go for longer walks. Their bond felt even stronger now, deepened by an understanding that went beyond words, rooted in the silent loyalty that had held them both through the hardest days. In a final act of closure, George built a small wooden marker at the site of Buddy's grave, engraving it with the words, "In memory of a loyal friend." He placed it in the ground, feeling a bittersweet satisfaction that Buddy's life, however brief, had not been forgotten. The marker became a place of quiet reflection, a reminder of the unseen sacrifices and silent connections that shape lives in ways beyond understanding. For Kiki, the marker seemed to signify an end to his mourning. He would occasionally stop by it, sniffing at the flowers George left, but he no longer lingered with that far-off look in his eyes. Instead, he walked beside George with a renewed purpose, a calm assurance that they were both exactly where they were meant to be. As winter settled over Maplewood, George noticed how the season's stillness brought a quiet peace to their lives. With the snow blanketing the woods, George and Kiki found solace in their routine once more. It had been a journey of heartbreak and healing, but Kiki had returned to his joyful self, his spirit lightened and his eyes bright. George saw his friend not only as the dog he'd missed, but as a survivor who had faced his own battles and emerged stronger. Each day felt like a gift to George, who took nothing for granted now. He began writing in a journal each morning, recording little moments he shared with Kiki, the way Kiki looked at him with those knowing eyes, the burst of energy he showed when George tossed him a ball. These small memories became treasures, reminders of the resilience they both possessed. For George, these entries were more than just stories. They were pieces of a journey that had transformed them both. One snowy afternoon, while resting by the fireplace, George sat with Kiki nestled close, his head resting on George's lap. George looked down at him, feeling an overwhelming gratitude for the bond they shared. "You've been through so much, haven't you?" he murmured softly, running his fingers through Kiki's golden fur. Kiki tilted his head up, his eyes meeting George's with a depth that felt almost human. It was a look of understanding, as if he too recognized the weight of all they had overcome together. Inspired by their journey, George decided to share Kiki's story with the community. He wanted to remind people that true friendship isn't just about joy. It's also about weathering the storms together, about enduring loss and finding hope again. At a town gathering, George shared their story, recounting Kiki's mysterious disappearance, his return, and the silent friendship with Buddy that had left a mark on both their lives. As George spoke, people listened in rapt attention, some wiping tears as he described the quiet loyalty Kiki had shown, even in his darkest moments. The story resonated deeply with the townspeople. Some shared stories of their own lost pets. Others recalled moments when a loyal companion had helped them through their hardest times. George realized that in telling Kiki's story, he'd given a voice to the unspoken bonds people held dear. It wasn't just about a dog returning home, it was about resilience, the way love could reach across distances and hardships to bring healing. Kiki became something of a hero in the town. People would stop by to visit, bringing treats and toys, while children gathered around to listen to George's tales of Kiki's bravery. George saw how the story had touched hearts, but what moved him most was how it had created a community of shared healing. People would stop by, talking not only about Kiki but also about loved ones they'd lost, sharing their own memories and finding comfort in the understanding of others. For George, the transformation in Kiki wasn't just a personal triumph. It had brought him closer to his neighbors and helped him feel a renewed sense of purpose. The loneliness he'd once felt now seemed like a distant memory, replaced by a quiet joy in knowing he was part of something bigger, a community bound by shared experiences and mutual understanding. Kiki, ever faithful, seemed to understand too, trotting along beside George with a proud, gentle presence, as if he, too, felt the gratitude in every step they took. The winter days turned into spring, and with it, new life began to bloom in Maplewood. George watched the flowers blossom, the trees regaining their green, feeling the same renewal in his own heart. He and Kiki continued their walks, venturing to places they'd once avoided, reclaiming each trail as a symbol of their resilience. Kiki was no longer afraid. Instead, he greeted each new path with a light step, as if finally free from the shadows of the past. One day, as they neared Buddy's resting place, George noticed that Kiki didn't linger there anymore. He sniffed the ground and moved on, his tail wagging, his gaze ahead. George took this as a sign that Kiki had truly found peace, that he'd come to terms with his journey. The grave remained, lovingly adorned with fresh flowers, a testament to the loyalty that had bound two dogs together in life and beyond. But for Kiki, the past had finally let go. George had also found his own peace. He no longer looked out the window waiting for something to change. Instead, he greeted each day with a sense of fulfillment. He realized that his journey with Kiki had shown him that love doesn't diminish with loss. It only grows deeper, transforming the pain into something beautiful. They had both survived, and together, they had turned their shared sorrow into a new kind of strength. On their final walk of the season, as the sun dipped low and cast a warm glow across the trees, George paused, looking at Kiki with a bittersweet smile. He knelt down, wrapping his arms around his friend. "Thank you, Kiki," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion, "for bringing me back to life." Kiki licked George's face, his tail wagging furiously as if he understood every word. In that moment, George felt an unbreakable bond, a connection that went beyond anything he could put into words. They had shared a journey through sorrow and healing, emerging with a love that was stronger than ever. In the end, Kiki's story wasn't just about a lost dog finding his way home. It was a testament to the quiet power of loyalty and resilience. George knew that, no matter what lay ahead, they would face it together, their hearts forever bound by a journey that had tested and transformed them both. And as they walked home under the setting sun, George felt the warm presence of peace, a promise that he and Kiki were exactly where they belonged. As George and Kiki continued their journey together, their story became a lasting inspiration in Maplewood, a reminder of the power of loyalty, love, and resilience. People often stopped George to express how much Kiki's story had touched them, giving them courage to face their own struggles with hope. For George, Kiki had become more than a friend. He was a symbol of survival, a companion who had walked beside him through life's hardest trials and emerged with a heart still open to love. On quiet mornings, George would sit by the window, watching Kiki chase butterflies across the yard, the joy of life reflected in his every movement. Each moment was a gift, a reminder that they had been given a second chance to walk this journey together, one step at a time. In their shared silence, George found a deep contentment, knowing that, come what may, he and Kiki had already braved the darkest storms and found peace on the other side. The lesson Kiki taught him echoed in his heart daily, that true healing comes from facing pain head-on, from walking through the shadows and trusting that love will light the way. George hoped their story would remind others of the strength that lies in every quiet act of loyalty, every step toward forgiveness, and every chance to let love heal even the deepest wounds. As the years passed, George and Kiki remained inseparable, their lives woven together by a bond that neither time nor hardship could break. And in the quiet of Maplewood, where the seasons turned and the leaves whispered tales of love and loss, their story lived on, a testament to the enduring strength of friendship and the quiet miracle of finding one's way home. It's an honor to be able to create content for you. If you want to support the channel even more, you can follow the instructions that I will leave on the pinned comment. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. Love you all.